Welcome to our podcast series on diversity and inclusion, brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading independent professional body dedicated to promoting best practice and raising the standards of coaching worldwide. I'm Dr. Alexandra Morgan, Senior Lecturer and Coach Educator. In this series, we're privileged to be talking to a superb range of coaches and consultants whose work is making a significant contribution to advancing diversity and inclusion in society and in the coaching profession. We hope this series sparks curiosity and encourages change. Welcome, everybody. I'm Alex Morgan, and welcome to our podcast series on equity, diversity and inclusion. And with me today, I have Charmaine Roche, who is a coach supervisor and coaching researcher. Hi, Charmaine.
Hi, Alex. Really pleased to be here.
Yeah, it's great. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So welcome, Charmaine. And what I'd like to get straight into is I know that you have recently published, a report called Racial Justice, Equity and Belonging in Coaching. You're the co-author of that with Jonathan Passmore. And I read it recently with great interest, and thank you for it because I think it's timely and well needed. But I wondered if you could just give us and the listeners a quick précis of what the report covers.
Yes. That's going to be a challenge, doing a quick précis. I haven't practiced a quick précis. But just to say that the report will be published next week by Henley. It will be available on the Henley website. And we're also setting up a website that people can go to become signatories to the report. It was quite a journey, actually, from getting involved in the research to the point where we're about to publish. And for me, I think the most significant thing about the report is that the participants, I mean, that might seem like an obvious statement, but the participants were Black, Indigenous coaches of colour from the UK, USA, Africa, principally Kenya and South Africa, and a group of Maori coaches from New Zealand. And the research question, which is a question that arose out of the moment that led to the inception of Jonathan Passmore initiated the research, and it grew out of that moment, the collective trauma that has come out of the pandemic and its coincidence with the murder of George Floyd. So the question that moment generated for us was, what needs to change in the world of coaching for it to take an anti-racist approach because of the lack of meaningful response from within the coaching system. I'll say system because there was response from coaches. If you were in LinkedIn over that period of time from the murder of George Floyd onwards, all the questions being raised about diversity, inclusion, belonging, lots of coaches were involved in that debate, asking questions. People were posting blogs, about when's coaching going to put its 2 pennies worth into the debate. And I think by that we mean our representatives, the people we feel should be there to speak on our behalf.
So the, as you say, there is a lack of response from the coaching system, or shall we call it the coaching industry, and individuals responded, as you said. So where should the voices have come from? The statements, the messages, where should those have come from?
Well, that's an interesting question because I always tend to back off from the word should.
Okay.
I think there's an ethical issue here, but not necessarily a moral imperative, as in should, which implies judgment. But I do think there's an ethical imperative. So I'm going to go back to the voices that we spoke to in the report before we come back to the response of the establishment or industry or whatever we want to call it.
Yeah, okay.
Anecdotally, people were talking about the way in which systemic racism is visible in the coaching industry, just simply in terms of representation. Let's just take that one as the most obvious. The lack of diversity in terms of race in coaching pools, for example. So let's just take that as one example. There was this sort of anecdotal, if you like, realization that there was something systemically out of balance in terms of the structure of the industry. And when I did a search, there were blogs. I found 2 blogs that were written in 2018. One was written by David Clutterbuck, actually, talking about systemic racism in the coaching system. There was another one by another coach whose name I've forgotten, who talked about the same issue about the global majority being people of colour, Black, Indigenous people of colour, and yet in a booming industry, they're so underrepresented. And it's not because the coaches aren't present, that they're not choosing to be trained, but they are in a minority. And then in terms of the more lucrative types of work in coaching, corporate coaching pools, they're virtually absent, really. So there was this anecdotal evidence, but there was no research in the coaching looking into this question. This report is the first of its kind. That in itself says a lot.
Yes, I mean, if you think about the age of the coaching industry,
absolutely. And if you compare it to sports coaching, for example, there's just a plethora of research looking at institutional racism, and there's absolutely nothing in coaching, executive coaching, life coaching, personal development, people development.
Yeah.
So hearing these voices, asking these voices for testimony in relation to this question was absolutely crucial. And the fact that it's a global spread of coaches, different contexts, but similar themes came out of them was also really instructive. But it's important to keep in mind when you look at the themes, the similarity of the themes that came out of the research, that the context in which the specific experiences came out of are absolutely really important.
Can you talk us through some of the themes?
Okay, so for me, the theme that came out very strongly quite early on was the complexity of identity. So one of the predominant forms that structural racism in coaching takes is presence of colour blindness. There is a very sort of well-meaning liberal approach that says we're all equal here. There's no difference between us. But for people whose lived experiences of daily microaggressions, underrepresentation in leadership, high levels of disparities in terms of employment, education, health, access to healthcare, overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, in the mental health system, that is not adequate. It's worse than that. It's another form of violence. It produces trauma, and it exacerbates intergenerational trauma from the historic issues that affect and are brought about the conditions that create these disparities, in different ways, globally, but in different ways for different groups of people. So to say you don't see the colour of someone's skin is to dismiss the impact of those systemic disparities.
Yeah, it's rejecting their lived experience.
Absolutely. And a core aspect of their identity. One of the other thing that some of the research I found tells us is that a positive racial identity is a protective factor against the psychological impacts of racism.
Okay. Yeah.
Interestingly, there's also racial identity theory in terms of white people, which show how important racial awareness is in terms of the transition to becoming anti-racist. So an understanding of whiteness as a racial identity is important. And that is also something I think is very poorly understood within the coaching industry. It's changing, and I want to acknowledge that, but people like myself are finding the process of that change painfully slow. And I mean that in every way, psychologically, physically, emotionally, painful. I think the one that has stayed with me most strongly is an example from South Africa, principally because of the history of apartheid, the struggle against apartheid, the ending of apartheid, and we're now in a post-apartheid era. And I think it's important to remember that context when I make reference to this testimony. So this testimony is from a Black female coach in her 60s. I think she may be be 60.
Mm-hmm.
Or she was 60 at the time of participating in the research. She's been coaching for 15 years. She's accredited, credentialed, highly qualified. The most painful statement she gave as a participant was about the fact that to gain access to corporate spaces, she has to have a white colleague introduce her in.
Wow.
Because without that, her words were, I'm not seen as having any worth without being introduced in by a white. These are colleagues who are friends.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't, and they're doing her a favour, but it's the fact that
it has to happen.
It has to happen.
Good grief.
And then the next thing, which I'm going to say, which to me then makes the situation more painful, is that when this was shared with the professional association representatives who participated in the research as an example of one of the structural issues, it was explained away as an example of the immaturity of the market in Africa. It's a young market.
What coaching is the young market?
It's a young market, which isn't true.
No.
Well, relative to, I mean, you might know differently from me, but relative to coaching in Europe, it arrived in Africa later. If you take coaching as being the models that we associate with European style coaching.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying.
If you see coaching more as a social process, I would agree with you, no. That's another thing that came out of the research, is that coaching as a process in amongst BIPOC communities, if I use the acronym, is not associated with any of these Western models of coaching like GROW or whatever. Yeah. That it's more to do with empowerment and helping the next generation, or very, very associated with mentoring, actually. So you have the role of elders in relation to and that is seen by these groups of coaches as being part of their tradition, their introduction, their transition into coaching as a process. So it has different roots and definitely is more related to a social change or a social process rather than Western coaching, which is more to do with performance enhancement, individual self-actualization. More of a social dimension and a community dimension to the way that these coaches talked about it as a tradition, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense.
But to go back to the main point, is that whatever reasoning you might give, it's not an adequate response to say that it's to do with the maturity of the market, because we don't have to accept these things as givens when they're associated with such an unjust, dehumanizing effect. And in the context of South Africa.
Yeah, I'm almost speechless at this point. And, I can see why this, this is, as you said at the beginning, this creates pain. This contributes to the trauma, and to be given, I'm sorry to kind of get cross at this point, kind of with you, but to be given such feeble excuses as to why something's not happening is just outrageous from my point of view.
And this is where I think, that the role of professional associations is absolutely vital. They should be providing an ethical compass to the profession. If there is a should in my language, that's where the should lies.
Okay. I'm comfortable with that should. I noticed in your report that you were also talking, connected with the associations, because associations produce a list, they publish a list of competencies, for example, don't they? And I remember noticing in your report that you were talking about the fact that race is just not mentioned in these competencies. No,
I think they have to be, to make it meaningful in the terms that we're talking, they have to be interpreted. But that's part of the issue, isn't it? That it becomes a question of individual choice as to whether a coach interprets the references to identity or respecting the client and their context. I think this is the general sort of language that's used. and so it's very dependent on the individual coach to make that interpretation. I think there is a slow change taking place. I mean, in terms of my searches, for example, when we started doing the research at the end of 2018, I did a search of the coaching association's websites. Some of them had no mention of even inclusion and diversity. Those that didn't mention race at that time. None of them mentioned race. And then about 6, maybe 8 months later, that had changed. So race began to be mentioned as one of the aspects of diversity that had to be taken into consideration alongside gender and the other intersection. If you're familiar with the intersectionality with the other intersectional identities. So there is slow progress. But in terms of a systemic awareness as to how coaching contributes to the pattern of systemic disparities itself and reflects these as part of society, it reflects them, that is still nowhere to be seen in anything that's currently published. It's all down to individuals to take responsibility for their levels of awareness, etc., their conduct.
Yeah. And this sort of circles back around to the point we were making at the beginning about what was the coaching system's response.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've mentioned a couple of things that need to change in this context, but what else needs to change?
I'm going to broaden out the discussion a little bit before if I answer that specifically, if that's all right.
Yeah, please do.
Because I've a general concern, which is why I started my research journey in the first place, about the purpose of coaching. There are many aspects of, if we just confine ourselves to the workplace as a social context for change, our workplaces are predominant. I don't want to overgeneralize, but workplaces for many people are experienced as oppressive. And that's not just on the basis of race. For women, white women, as well as women of colour, black women, basis of gender, sexuality, ability, neurodiversity. Any of these are part of your identity and lived experience. You can experience a workplace as oppressive. In fact, just on the question of values, if you have social justice values in a predominantly neoliberal performative value system, you can experience the workplace as oppressive. And as a coach, that was the context in which I started to ask my questions. I was working with teachers in the education system whose distress was being addressed by attributing all their well-being issues to workload. But in coaching these individuals, that's not what I saw. What I saw was an existential crisis brought about by the desire to perform their role as educators according to a set of values that was at odds with the dominant values and practices of their profession. There's a researcher called Stephen Ball, professor of sociology and education, who's had a lifetime of research looking into that whole period from the 1980s through to the present day, in which this neoliberalization of education took place. And he talks about it as the formativity, and he talks about it as a form of terror that erodes the soul. I forgot the precise phrase he uses, but this is the sort of language he uses based on the qualitative data and interviews with teachers. And I think this is a society-wide phenomenon. It showed up for me in coaching educators, but I think it's across the public health system. And I would speculate that it's probably quite a prevalent aspect of our experience as beings in society. So I think the question, what are the ethics of coaching for social change, if that is your intent as a coach, in oppressive context, which is my research question, is a broad question that coaching needs to address. And there'll be specific contexts in which it can be explored. And what it calls into question are some of the core normative principles of tenets of coaching, I call them tenets of coaching, such as neutrality. Right? So when we talk about coach neutrality, what are we actually talking about? What do we mean? And we can have a little bit of a conversation about my take on that based on the small explorations I've made so far. But it's because there are at least two sides to looking at that question. There's the association with neutrality with the stance of the coach, and then there's association of neutrality in their relationship to the client.
And then, in terms of who is the client, the coachee in front of you, the wider system.
Exactly.
And if you are coaching someone,
follow through.
I think we're on the same page, but again, we're kind of excited in an agitated way about this. If you're a coach in a system which is oppressive, how can you remain neutral? If you are helping your coachee to just survive in that system, is that good work? Big question mark. Anyway, back to you, Charmaine. I'm sure you were just about to say the same.
There is a level. What I do want to say though is that there is an important principle which I think we conflate with neutrality, which is the unconditional, non-judgmental stance of
unconditional positive regard. Or from what it's called. Yeah,
that's the one I was struggling to remember. The unconditional positive regard. But even when I think about that as a core principle, which is of value, absolute value in coaching, it has limits. So it isn't an absolute. So let me take that back. It is of importance, but it is not an absolute. Because for me, there will be limits. Because again, as you said, who am I showing this unconditional positive regard to in any given moment in a coaching conversation? So if my coachee was to make, for example, a racist statement, who in that moment do I need to show unconditional positive regard for? What intent do I need to serve in that moment? Who are the stakeholders' interests? Which stakeholder interests am I serving in that moment? And how does that determine my response? For me, that is an ethical question. That is an ethical decision, how I respond in that moment.
And I assume we'd hope we would respond in an authentic way that is true to our own values. But I know it's never as straightforward, as simple as that.
I think we need to know, because we don't know what the values are we're referring to. What values? Do we assume that every coach has the same values, and these values are necessarily aligned with what I'm calling a social justice set of values? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Some people may not even see that. Let's take something quite uncontroversial, like the issue of negative self-talk. I was coaching a director in a retail chain, which will remain nameless. And she was talking about herself, about her insecurities, her lack of confidence in certain situations. And she was saying some phrases again and again. And I said, whose voice is that? And it turned out that the voice was a previous male boss who had mercilessly bullied her.
Wow.
And totally got away with it. She found herself being let go as a result of that.
Script is still in her head.
Absolutely. So this is, as far as I'm concerned, given the lens I've developed over the last 3 years, this is a form of internalized oppression. She's internalized that voice. I think the question I then asked her was, or the observation I made is, you are now relating to yourself in the same way that he was relating to you. For her, that was a liberating moment of recognition, because she stopped blaming herself.
Fantastic. Yeah.
And started to be able to develop other ways of managing similar patterns that were developing in her current work relationships. So, race might be an obvious place where we need this lens, but I would say we need it everywhere. We need it everywhere in our work. Imposter syndrome. Where's that come from? Isn't that Isn't that actually a class-based form of internalized oppression? I know that's where if I ever call myself, say I've got imposter syndrome, I know that's where it comes from.
Yeah, could be class, could be gender.
Yeah, class. For me, it was definitely class. It was the sense that I felt when I joined the teaching profession. I thought, oh God, should I be here? I don't have the right accent, so I normalised my accent. I got rid of the Derbyshire twang and made sure I didn't have any Jamaican patois accent. That was beaten out of me by my parents. Like, sorry, Mum. He didn't beat me. But I use that term metaphorically. But it was that we weren't allowed to use a Jamaican patois for the reason that we felt it would prevent us assimilating.
Yes.
If only that was the only problem to assimilate.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's not go there.
So, you're right. Imposter syndrome is a symptom, if you want to call it that, of some kind of oppression.
Yeah.
And, I felt, this is just a kind of an aside, but, there was a bit of me that was both proud and depressed this week, where my daughter was invited. She's a 20-something civil engineer, and she was invited to speak about imposter syndrome at a local university.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you feel proud. Good for you. You've been invited to speak. And then at the same time, oh God, we're still talking about imposter syndrome, are we, all these years later?
And why was she invited to talk about it? Presumably she's a young woman.
She's a young woman, successful. Yeah, young woman in STEM.
There we go.
Not necessarily feeling you've got the right to take the space in STEM, which she tells me she's been feeling, interestingly, since her A-level maths lesson, where, the teachers and the boys in the class made her feel like she wasn't necessarily supposed to be there. Anyway, 2 A stars and an A later and a master's degree.
Yeah. We have to ask why. It's a bit like, as a Black person being asked to come and talk about racism, why should she be? Okay, it's recognition, and that's a good thing that she's recognised. But given that she's successful, why is she talking about it? Why aren't the men and the boys creating the culture out there talking about how they're going to prevent people from having imposter syndrome? Why aren't they carrying the burden?
Yeah, quite. Yeah. Anyway, we digress, but it was kind of
interestingly.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Wow, it is a very interesting conversation. We were talking a while back about the complexity of identity and hearing the voices, that you'd heard through your research. Are there any other themes that came through your research that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah, there were 4 major themes. So the complexity of identity was one. The complexity of identity is a response to the existence of systemic racism. So the first thing was systemic racism in the coaching industry is real. It exists. The second one was as a sort of interacting factor with the reality of systemic racism is the complexity of identity. And then the third one was the resources and the strategies that coaches have developed in order to cope and manage and work within the system.
Yeah.
In quite innovative ways, but also quite exhausting and debilitating ways. That's there are these tensions in each of the themes. There are these tensions. And then the final theme was the sort of the promise for barriers and promise for change. So the promise for change is that coaching as a process and as a methodology has the potential to resource us as change makers. The fact that coaching is supposed to enable people to deal with difficulty and challenge and complexity is something that's part of the rhetoric, talk about coaching. And we feel that if it's used well, mindfully, and with the right ethical lens and knowledge and sensitivity, it can be used to deal with open up these conversations about race and other forms of discriminatory practice in workplaces, in society more broadly, and be a social change agent. The process can be a social change agent, and the people who use coaching as a process can be agents for change. So those are principally the 4 themes that came out. But the counteracting tension in that theme was the fact that because race is such a difficult subject and creates so many so much defensiveness, and also as a system, as a global system, the research describes it as being infinitely malleable. So whenever it's challenged, it changes its face, it changes its language, it changes the way that it positions itself in order to remain in place.
I can't quite get my handle on that. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, colour blindness is quite a good example. So in the wake of the civil rights movement in the United States and then throughout Europe, equal rights legislation, equalities legislation, and then the ending of apartheid in South Africa, it's generally recognised that there was a shift towards the characterisation of a post-racial era.
Mm.
There was a lot of debate about this when Barack Obama became president. And then there was a disappointment that, actually, despite the fact that we have a black president in the USA, there's still systemic racism.
Mm.
But by that time, there had developed this language of a post-racial world where we were all equal. Look, we've got all this equal rights legislation. We've got civil rights legislation in America, equal rights legislation in Europe. We're in a post-racial era. We're all equal. Everybody's the same. And then whenever any member of the global majority, I'll use that term, mentioned racism or systemic racism, they were treated as if they had a chip on their shoulder. What are you talking about? Look at all these civil rights legislation. We're all equal. We're all, etc. That is a very good example as to how racism morphed in response to the pushback by the civil rights and equalities struggles for equality. And it's not just race, gender, they all sort of combine to create a raft of changes, social changes. But, you just look at the Me Too movement and how that gets pushed back, and the Trump followed Obama. If that doesn't, and then didn't he start this whole thing about, well, it's the white people are oppressed, and I do believe that white people are oppressed amongst the oppressed. I'm not into this thing about black people competing to the most oppressed people on the planet. It's not a competition. We live in a world's global system born out of capitalist economic relations that are essentially oppressive. And only the elite are the ones who benefit from it. The rest of us in various forms are oppressed by it. We are wage slaves. Those of us at the top of the food chain, at the end of the day, are wage slaves or salary slaves. All it takes is for us to lose our job. Where are we? Because we don't have a social system to protect us very much anymore.
And as a result, we put up with oppressive systems.
Absolutely.
Don't we? Because we don't feel that we have a choice.
So this is a self-reinforcing nature. And, you can see a lot of it still, you can find many very contemporary examples of it.
So, Charmaine, we're beginning to run out of time a bit, but I don't want to stop this conversation because it's so rich and so important. But I feel like it's time that we come round to what were the recommendations that your report made, because I know we've had a conversation about that before, and you said, well, I think I'm going to use my own words for what I think you said to me at the time, Charmaine, which is they are recommendations, but they're really just the start, and they're relatively basic recommendations, I think was what you said to me. So tell me about the recommendation and tell me why we're still at the basic stage.
Yeah, there are essentially 15 recommendations, and they're in categories to address different sectors within the coaching ecosystem, as we've called it. There's a global coaching community. So there's the opening recommendations addressed to the global coaching community. And that is principally to create a baseline, to make our statements about diversity, inclusion, belonging evidence-based, because we collect no data whatsoever about patterns of disparity across the coaching ecosystem. And given that it is growing globally, it's becoming more, the global south is becoming more of a marketplace for growth. It is a big issue. So there's that. Then there's education. There's some recommendations addressed to the education providers. And that predominantly has to do with representation on BIPOC coaches on faculties, decolonising the curriculum to make the curriculum more attractive to those coaches. Because one of the things is I think, well, why would we want to come and train with you if our worldview, our perspective is not represented there? Our realities aren't part of the learning process. I don't arrive as a blank sheet, so I want to be seen. And that, I think, is one of the more deep recommendations. So the one about collecting data is a basic one. But the thing about decolonising curricula is more of a deeper one, and having a really diverse faculty and not just in terms of race, but, truly diverse in the full sense of the word.
And also, just to echo a point you made earlier, also a diverse view as to what coaching actually is.
Absolutely. Yeah. More pluralism, I think. Plurality of views from different perspectives, different traditions, different philosophies.
Yeah.
And then there's professional bodies. So again, this is to do with about the sort of data they collect or don't collect.
Yeah.
Representation, particularly in leadership, and taking an ethical or leadership role modeling leadership on social justice, equity, and inclusion, and in managing their relationships with other parts of the ecosystem in relation to that. So their relationship with training providers is what we specifically mentioned there. And then coach providers. So there are some big corporate coach providers, places like Coach Hub, and there's a growing proliferation of online coaching platforms, which their recruitment and criteria is so exclusive, so excluding.
Yes. Yeah.
And this is mentioned in the report, the criterion by which you're selected, because of the structural inequities in society, automatically exclude certain types of people. So you get a replication within the system because people are being coached by people just like them, essentially.
Yeah. So to give a practical example, I think if what you're saying, if you're only allowed to coach for those organizations, if you have been on worked at C-suite level, the odds of a whole range of diverse coaches not being able to put the names forward because they've been structurally prevented from working at C-suite level in the first place. So it becomes self-fulfilling, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And if you were looking for coaches who might bring a difference in perspective to the coaching that might challenge the norms in those cultures, you'd be looking for different types of leadership experience. A lot of people who would be excluded might have leadership experience in communities, for example, in activism, in providing social support systems, a lot of leadership experience, but that's not the sort of leadership experience that's being looked for.
Yes. I think when we talked before and I heard the word basic, I think it was more like what you're suggesting are things that are fundamental. But basic's not the right word. If they're fundamental, they should be straightforward. They should be obvious. It should be easily achieved. And yet it isn't. And as you said, your research paper is quite lonely.
At the moment.
At the moment. Yeah. But good for you to have done the research, to have heard those voices, to have got this paper written. And I know for you it's part of a wider research experience, isn't it? Because you're doing a doctorate as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm doing a PhD and But I'm currently working on the literature review, which I feel I need to write to kind of systematize the learning I've done so far, to integrate it, synthesize it. But I will then be going out to collect more data. So I hope to be hearing more voices because I want to hear from those coaches who might be doing work like, say, with prison communities, or quite a lot of work doing with trying to help women leaders get into senior leadership roles. There's quite a lot of this work which has this social change edge to it. So I'm very interested in hearing more voices to see how the findings from the research report that we've been talking about might be replicated or reflected in when looking at these other forms of oppressive contexts.
Yeah, thank you. So Charmaine, if somebody would like to get in touch with you about your research or your work, how do they do that? Where do they find you?
I think LinkedIn, is probably a good place to look for me. Follow me on LinkedIn. You can get any of my contact information from LinkedIn. I have a website, www.lifeflowbalance.co.uk, and ResearchGate. So I have a profile on ResearchGate.
Okay.
So if you're also, I think you have to actually be a member of ResearchGate to find me on there. But
yeah, it is quite straightforward, having done it myself.
All the papers that I write published on ResearchGate. Some of them will be too big to disseminate by social media, so that will be a good place to go. And there are two papers linked to the report we've been discussing today, going through peer review, which hopefully will be available to read, because that report, the racial justice report, is actually just draws only from a small segment of the data.
Right.
There is a larger paper that's been written, which hopefully which references much more of the data for those who want to go a bit deeper.
Good. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Charmaine. I wish you well. I shall be certainly following you and your research as we go forward. And thank you for such an interesting conversation.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for inviting me.
So thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. I've been Alex Morgan. Our purpose is to inspire and champion coaching excellence to advance the coaching profession and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organisations and in turn society. If you'd like to find out more, please follow us on LinkedIn and explore our webpage at theassociationforcoaching.com. There you can keep up to date with our latest episodes and conversations, as well as our digital learning calendar.